So, Beautiful by Carol Ann Duffy. And this is the first section. The poem comes in 4 sections, and I will be breaking each section down within itself. She was born from an egg, a daughter of the gods, divinely fair, a pearl, drop-dead gorgeous, beautiful, a peach, a child of grace, a stunner in her face, the star-like sorrows of immortal eyes, who looked there loved. She won the heart of every man she saw. They stood in line, sighed, knelt, beseeched, be mine. She married one, but every other mother's son swore to be true to her till death, enchanted by the perfume of her breath, her skin's celebrity. So when she took a lover, Fledge was nowhere to be seen, her side of the bed unslept in, cold, the small coin of her wedding ring left on the bedside table like a tip, the wardrobe empty of the drama of her clothes. It was war. 1,000 ships, on every one 1,000 men, each heaving at an oar, each with her face before his stinging eyes, her name tattooed upon the muscle of his arm, a handkerchief she dropped once for his lucky charm, each seeing her as a local girl made good, the girl next door, a princess with the common touch, queen of his heart, pin-up, superstar, the heads of every coin he'd tossed, a smile on every note he'd bet at cards, bragged and shoved across 1,000 miles of sea. Meanwhile, lovely she lay high up in a foreign castle's walls, clasped in a hero's brawn, loved and loved and loved again. Her cries like the bird of calamities, drifting down to the boys at the gate, who marched now to the syllables of her name. Beauty is fame. Some said she turned into a cloud and floated home, falling there like rain or tears upon her husband's face. Some said her lover woke to find her gone, his sword and clothes gone too, before they sliced a last grin in his throat. Some swore they saw her smuggled on a boat dressed as a boy, towed to a ship which slid away at dusk, beckoned by a finger of the moon. Some vowed that they were in the crowd that saw her hung, stared up at her body as it swung there on the creaking rope, and noticed how the black silk of her dress clung to her form, a stylish shroud. Her maid, who loved her most, refused to say one word to anyone at any time or place, would not describe one aspect of her face or tell one anecdote about her life and loves, but lived alone and kept a little bird inside a cage. Now, in many ways, this section of the poem, well, each section of the poem could be a poem in its own right. But we do have to remember while we're looking at this is only one section out of 4. Now, each section is dedicated to a particular woman from history, or, in this case, mythology. So, Helen of Troy is the object of this particular part of the poem. She was indeed in Greek mythology born from an egg. She was a daughter of the gods, and she left or was kidnapped from her husband Menelaus, and the war referred to is the mythological Trojan War, which comes into Greek literature such as the Iliad and the Odyssey. So it's very important that you're aware of Helen of Troy and the fact that though her name is never mentioned, this is a clear allusion to Helen of Troy. So I'm going to go through the poem line by line, roughly, and explain some of my annotations and how they impact on the poem. So automatically, the fact that she was born from an egg is very important, because that means that she's not human. And if she's not human, that suggests that the beauty she has is not possible. This is immediately underlined by daughter of the gods, the idea that she is mythical. And it's important that Caroline Duffy starts a poem called Beautiful with this mythical allusion, because she's suggesting that beauty itself is an abstract concept. Caroline Duffy is often thought of as a feminist poet, and you can read just in these first two lines here the way that she is criticising how women are often portrayed and the need for them to be beautiful, because she's saying beautiful women in history, those who are valued. One of them is Helen of Troy. Helen of Troy wasn't real. And then she underlines this, very typical of Duffy, in her asyndetic listing. And asyndetic listing is something that we find throughout the Feminine Gospels collection. It's something we find throughout this poem. There's a later on, even in this section, you have another asyndetic list. And asyndetic simply means that she doesn't use conjunctions, it's all commas. But what it does is it quickens the pace. And it suggests that it's going on forever. The adjective divinely is quite an unusual one. I find it interesting that Caroline Duffy's chosen such an adjective, because it's not one that you would often use in life. And actually, when combined with fair, it's particularly interesting, because fair normally isn't a description of someone who's beautiful. Fair usually suggests that it's plain. So, although it might normally be someone plain, because it's got the adjective divinely in front of it, Caroline Duffy has modified it and shown that anything can be beautiful in its own way. Typically, she uses colloquialism, drop dead gorgeous. Peach, again, a colloquialism. And these really are very typical of Duffy. The use of the didactic in educating, but more importantly, the use of demotic language. And when you're talking about Caroline Duffy and her demotic language, you can say that it's her influence from William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth is a poem who Duffy attributes some of her poetic style to, and demotic language was one of William Wordsworth's key principles, which is seen here in Beautiful and throughout Caroline Duffy's work, both in Feminine Gospels and her wider collections. So the focus of this first stanza really is beauty. But, most importantly, who looks there loved suggests that beauty is a reason for love. And the fact that Duffy is a feminist poet, again, what we're seeing here is the beginnings of condemnation for the fact that love could be based on looks, because love is in fact an emotional connection not physical attraction in that sense. What I think is really interesting is this line though, star-like sorrows of immortalize, especially star-like sorrows, because to some extent it's sibilance, but it's also quite a juxtaposition. Star-like gives implications of beauty, of positivity, of hope, whereas sorrows is a very negative word. And I think in that juxtaposition, if you like, star-like sorrows, Duffy is suggesting that within beauty there is the good and the bad. And Duffy is very good at that. She's never fully 100% condemning things, I don't think, but nor is she going to promote something that she doesn't agree with. In the next stanza, this is continued through verb 1. 1 alludes to the historical idea that women are prizes, that women are owned by men. And we're talking of a woman who, if she had been alive, would have been alive about 1100 BC. So over 3,000 years ago is when this is set. So you would expect to some extent gender roles to be very prominent. And personally, I see the fact that she won the heart as interesting, because automatically Duffy is changing what we expect. It's not him winning her, she's winning them. It reminds me of the final chapter of Jane Eyre, when it says, I married him. It's the female who has the power. And that's something that's really important in a lot of Duffy's poetry. It's the female taking the power. And that links in even with the title of the collection, Feminine Gospels, the fact that it is the female telling the story. She has the power, and he is the prize. And this really is quite atypical in literature. If you look back through text through time, you look at the Renaissance era into the neoclassical period, Victorian, you will often see women referred to as prizes. One example, this which comes to mind automatically, is Taming of the Shrew, but there are so many occasions throughout literature where the man tries to win the woman, where the man objectifies the woman. And here Caroline Duffy is subverting that, and she is objectifying the man, and she's giving the female the power. And it's not just in this line that Duffy does this. It is also apparent in these other lines I've highlighted. She married one, she took a lover. It's giving her the power continuously. And taking female power is a massive theme in Feminine Gospels. It's a huge theme in Feminine Gospels, because something which Duffy is advocating is the idea of her story. And this continues throughout the stanza. She married one, again, really reminiscent to me of Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is another book that I've studied, and the idea of the female taking control. Something else Duffy does in this stanza, which is relatively unusual in poetry, it's not unheard of, but it's quite unusual, which is actually using direct speech. And how Duffy demonstrates that direct speech is through italics. So another poem I can think of which uses direct speech is The Ruined Maid by Thomas Hardy. But most poems which utilise direct speech are epics, rather than short poetry, such as this. And in this case, Duffy she underlines the importance of the speech because of the internal rhyme with line. They stood in a line, be mine. That rhymes, and that underlines the importance of it. In the following line, you've again got the importance of female, the idea that men are not themselves, they are the sons of mothers, they are the sons of women, and they have been enchanted by the perfume of her breath. Here she's taking on that traditional role of the femme fatale, the woman who lures men. And in that sense, Duffy could be portraying her as a negative, but at the same time, she's also a female with power. Perhaps that power is sexual, in which case you've got the question about female roles. Is a woman defined by her sexuality and her attractiveness to men? Is that the only way in which one can be powerful? But actually, they're enchanted by the perfume of her breath. So perfume might be a traditional female idea, but the fact that it's the perfume of her breath, to me, suggests that that's speech. Her breath really suggests that it's her words which have enchanted them rather than her looks. And again, we have the continuation of the fact that she's in charge. She took the lover. That's just underlining point. Now there comes an interesting allusion to Trojan War, and the question of whether Helen was kidnapped or whether she left. So I'm going to highlight the lines which I think suggest that she left of her own accord in pink, and I'm going to highlight the lines which I think suggests that she was kidnapped in purple. Now if you look, you'll see that really Duffy is suggesting it was Helen's choice. Duffy is not suggesting that she was kidnapped. Duffy suggests that it was Helen's choice. And that was when Menelaus took 1,000 ships with 1,000 men on every ship, so 1,000,000 men, supposedly, to Troy in order to try and win her back. It's also worth noting that in the mythology behind Helen of Troy, she is listed as having many potential husbands. So as well as Paris and Menelaus, she has also been married by various accounts to Achilles, Idas, Lenthius, Corythus, Theseus, Deiphobus, Erasphorus, Corythus, Theoclymenos, and Helenus. But different interpretations give her different husbands at different times. And the one we're focused on here is her relationship with Menelaus and her relationship with Paris. And one way she does that is by giving the power to women. You'll see that in all of the poems and feminine gospels, there is a female protagonist. Or in this case, 4 female protagonists. Other ways you have that Duffy defies norms in this section are the way that Helen acts in taking a lover. So we've got this stanza, and then this stanza, both of which Helen does actions which are not traditionally feminine. Again, if you look at literature through time and you look at affairs which go on, 90% of the time in history or literature, it's the man who takes the choice. Now, it's possible, of course, that Helen has been seduced by Paris, but certainly in the 4th stanza, it suggests that she is at least complicit in the action. She's clasped in a hero's born, loved and loved and loved again. The idea of that sexuality, concept that she's moaning with her sexuality, the repetition of loved, obviously implying not only love in the emotion, but the act of sexual relations. It could be suggested that the fact that she's crying, her cries, like the birds of calamities. You could also take, especially if you're looking at 805 for the A-level, how that could be her sexual pleasure, but it could also be her cry for help. It could be her cry for help. What I find perhaps most disturbing in this section of the poem are these 4 lines here. These 4 lines here. Because I didn't really pick this up the first time I read through the poem, but every time since, I've thought, boy, this is suggesting that she kills Paris, one presumes, or because her lover woke to find her gone, his sword and clothes gone too, before they sliced the last grin in his throat. The suggestion that Helen took the power again. Helen said, you know what, no, this isn't what I want. I'm going to kill you. Really quickly, I want to pick up on a key connection that this poem has to the Long Queen. she's in this sibilance of some said. Because it is actually a direct quotation. The some said, some swore and some vowed is slightly different, but it's really significant that Duffy has chosen to use the exact same phrase, because she's also hereby linking beautiful with the Long Queen. So there's an AO4 link for connections between texts, but it also has the suggestions of the oral tradition, concept of storytelling, and the unknown. The fact that we don't know what happened to her. I think it's particularly poignant in this poem, where you've got these various different things about what happened to Helen. Did she turn into a cloud and go back to the sky? Did she kill Paris? For that matter, did she kill Menelaus? For although we assume that the fact that it says lover connects it to Paris as her lover, it could be that she's killed Menelaus. Is it that she was dressed as a boy? And you think about, if she was dressed as a boy, what does that suggest? Because if she had to be smuggled dressed as a boy, that suggests male power. It suggests that to be powerful, she's had to dress up, she's had to put on a false front, which contradicts some of the other things which are suggested about female power. And then you've got this last option, that she died. The black silk of her dress, that alludes to, or at least connects with, A Dreaming Week, a poem much later in the collection. The possibility of the sexuality held in that dress. But also in this, Caroline Duffy highlights another social point, which is the death penalty swung there on the creaking rope. There's this suggestion of implicit condemnation of the death penalty. The part which I personally found hardest on my first reading to analyse was these last two stanzas in the section. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to copy up the annotations which I have for these two stanzas, so you can see all of the thought processes which I've had, and compare how you think about it. Here's looking at the second section of Beautiful, and this section focuses on Cleopatra, who was, as far as we know, the only female pharaoh of Egypt, and the part of her life which Duffy directly alludes to in this section of the poem her affairs, first of all with Caesar, and then with Mark Antony. And the first thing I want to pick up on in this section of the poem is the prevalence of the pronoun she, and within that the pronoun her, because her is actually the objective case of the pronoun she. And in fact, the pronoun she actually accounts for nearly 11.5% of the words in this section of the poem, which really shows how important it is to Duffy that the female presence is clear. But it also highlights that the poem is impersonal, because despite these 47 references to either she or her, not once is the persona named as Cleopatra. Yet there are several indications which cause the reader to realise that Duffy is alluding to Cleopatra. First of all, looking at the poem as a whole, we can see that all 4 personas in the poem are allusions of figures in history, which gives us a clue that this will be. Then we have references to Caesar, and also later to Mark Antony, although these are less clear as Mark Antony is not named. You have the idea of Cleopatra's indulgence, something she was very well known for, her beauty, it's a beauty regime. Of course, the fact that this is a poem called Beautiful and the characters in it are all famous beauties, and Cleopatra was one of the most famous beauties. And finally, perhaps most significantly, these last 2 lines of armies changing sides of cities lost forever in the sea, referring to the war which started because of Cleopatra and the Sea of Snakes. The fact that the most commonly recognised way that Cleopatra died was that she was bitten by a poisonous snake, which also bit Mark Antony, so they died together. They were effectively committing suicide. One thing which is also made clear by the pronoun she is the extent of female control in this poem, and it's linking in with the theme of her story and feminism, which are both key themes throughout the whole of the text, and are both typical postmodern ideas. The most interesting things, well, say most interesting, if I look into feminism in detail in this section, there's a lot of very rich interpretation which you can take. So, from the very first stanza, the fact that she tumbled from a rug at Caesar's feet, seen him kneel to pick her up, and felt him want her as he did. It's bringing in straight away sexuality. The fact that she's at Caesar's feet suggests perhaps inferiority, but he kneels. And kneeling is a clear mark of respect, which suggests that though she's at his feet, he is in some way below her. And it's interesting in the context of Caesar and Cleopatra, because Julius Caesar was emperor of Rome, while Cleopatra was pharaoh of Egypt. So they were both royalty. They were both at the very top in their respective countries. But they would also have had to, in many ways, be submissive to the other when visiting each other's countries. But it becomes very clear early on that she has the power, with the idea that she had him gibbering in bed by 12, which refers back to the prevalence of sexuality. In the second stanza in this section, she's the one rolling the carpet, which is also very interesting, because if you think of a red carpet, which this seems to allude to, the red carpet, which is a mark of respect and a show of fame, if you roll out your own carpet, that's quite pretentious and suggests that your status is uncertain because you're having to do it yourself. On the other hand, her status is heightened or lifted by these 3 lines with typical listing of Duffy, which look at various ways that Cleopatra indulges herself, followed straight away by she knew her man, with the possessive pronoun there symbolising ownership in the opposite manner to what might be expected in history through time. Typically, men have owned women. And actually the fact that this was around 47 BC, so we're talking a long time before female rights activists. Nonetheless, it's clear that Caroline Duffy is not kidding herself in terms of the physical differences between men, and is perhaps emphasising them quite a lot, with the idea that he is 10 times her strength. Yet again, if we go later into the stanza, it's she who reached and pulled him down to Alexandria, the warm, muddy Nile. And I think that's probably one of the most sexual lines in the poem, or at least it is for me, because what the warm, muddy Nile suggests to me is sex. And it reminds me of in A Streetcar Named Desire, when Stanley says to Stella that he pulled her down off those columns and she liked it because it gave her sexual gratification, pleasure. It was the fulfillment of desire. And that image really resonates for me with these It's the idea that she pulled him down. She's pulling him down, showing him sexuality, the warm, muddy Nile. The fact that when you have sex, that makes you unclean, which would have been a very prominent thought at this time, that you would be unclean, muddy, the warmness, the idea of the two bodies interlaced, and the exchange of blood, which again links to the muddy. And I don't know if that's just me, but to me those two lines are really sexually powerful. And then it continues, and there's quite a light tone as the poem continues. She played with him at dice, rolled sixes in the dust, cleaned up, slipped her gambling hand into his pouch and took his gold, bit it. Got this typical asyndetic listing, typical of Duffy, typical of the postmodern era, and it creates a very fast pace. The idea that she's playing with him, again, she's in control, she has power, and this is despite the fact that at this point she's participating in traditionally masculine activities. Gambling, though the stereotype is probably no longer relevant, has in history traditionally been very masculine activity. What she's doing is she's forcing him to experience feelings of lust. So he crouched with lust. And that's Sejura, full stop, just really heightens everything. It makes it definite, certain. You've got the idea that she painted him again, she's in control. She lay above him. Now that is quite an interesting idea, because typically when we're looking at or thinking about people having sexual relations, it's unusual for the woman to be on top. It's not unheard of. It does happen, but it's a subversion of the norm, which again highlights how she's the one in control. And I think this is quite different to any of the other sections in Beautiful, because of how strong Cleopatra is as a woman, how strong she is, and how much control she has over the men in her life. The idea of the lipstick smeared on his mouth, her powder blushing on his stubble, is quite an interesting one in light of second wave feminism, when women would defy female objectification by burning their bras, etc., and doing things like refusing to wear makeup. So she's wearing the makeup, but she's making him wear the makeup as well. Or on the other side of that, you could suggest that she's been wearing it to please him, and in that sense it could be that she was in that sense submissive. And I wonder how much of the time in this section we're actually looking at a symbiotic relationship rather than he or her having power, whether it is symbiotic, whether the degree of equality within it. And then we have the return to traditionally masculine occupations. So glass for glass in drinking games. For most of history, drinking, and especially heavy drinking, has been more associated with men. Sucking lemons, lick up the salt, swallowing something from a bottle where a dead rat floated, gargle, doubles over, trebles, drowns a liquid fire in one, lit a coffee bean and something else, blew it, gulped, tipped chasers down her throat, pints down her neck, and held her drink until the big man slid beneath the table, wrecked. And what I really see in this stanza is her trying to live up to his standards, trying to prove that she is equal to a man. I think that's something that's very important for Cleopatra. At least in this poem, I can't speak about the pharaoh herself. And again, the fact things like having a dead rat floating, it's as if she's trying to prove that she is not weak. It's also quite modern, what we're bringing in here, the drinking game, sucking lemon. These whole ideas, they would be suitable in a modern environment. In fact, realistically, it's probably unlikely that they took place in ancient Egypt, and what Duffy's doing now is she's bringing it up, making it relevant to the modern day. And then in this final line in the stanza highlights that ultimately Cleopatra is the one who beats him. She lasts longer. The man is wrecked. She isn't. In fact, she is stronger than him. And now you could, it's arguable when this shifts from Caesar to Mark Antony. I would suggest probably at the beginning of this, it's the fourth stanza in the section. But what's really interesting in the very first two lines is that we're going back to the fulfillment of traditional female roles. So she's watching, she watched him hunt, he killed a stag. He's the provider, he's the hunter, he's the strong one. And she hacked the heart out, hid it dripping in the apron of her dress. She's doing the domestics. But actually, when Duffy uses the verb hacked, especially when Duffy uses the verb hacked with the alliteration with heart and hid, that hard H is a very hard H. It's actually the suggestion of defying gender stereotypes. So yes, she's the domestic at home, but she's violent. And the other thing that's interesting is that she is effectively fulfilling the role of a servant in some respects. You might expect that this role would be done by one of her household servants, and Cleopatra would have had a lot of hands, but she's choosing it to do it himself. But then again, she's watching him exercise. He is registered as the physically powerful one. And you've got this, is who has the physical power, who has the sexual power. I think those are two quite different things in this section of the poem. And the other thing is, I would suggest that she has more control, or Duffy suggests she has more control when she's with Caesar than when she's with Mark Antony. Again, she let her shawl slip down to show her shoulders, breasts, and every man that night saw them again and prayed her name. Now, she's got the sexual power, but she's exhibiting that sexual power in quite an anti-feminist manner by actually showing off her breasts. She is submitting, in some ways, to female objectification, and again, she's waving them off to war. But then, and it's still in the same stanza, and I think that's really important. There's no end stop. It's part of the same, well, you don't really have sentences in poetry, but it would be part of the same sentence if it was prose. Then pulled on boys' clothes. Right in the middle of the stanza, and she's saying, actually, no. I'm coming to. I'm going to be the man. And what Cleopatra ends up doing is actually forsaking her femininity to prove that she is as strong as a man. Made him fuck her as a lad. We're talking back to the sexuality, but whereas here the sexuality is full of desire and it's full of romance and sexual attraction. Made him fuck her as a lad. It's pragmatic. There's nothing. There's no emotion which seems to come from it. And then the last few lines almost enters into a degree of bathos. The asyndetic listing with anaphora of her to some extent. And then these last two lines of armies changing sides, of cities lost forever in the sea of snakes. The allusion to the war which broke out because between Rome and Egypt. I haven't actually done any research, but I know there was a war. And again, linking to the first part of the poem, when you've got Helen and the Trojan War, and then this final allusion to the fact that Antony and Cleopatra are thought to have committed suicide by both being bitten by a poisonous snake. Okay, so third section of the poem on Marilyn Monroe, and I'm taking the approach of looking through the different AOs or assessment objectives, specifically for A-level English literature. So, starting with A1, terminology. So you've got the caesura, which is prevalent. Unfortunately, the little red full stops don't show up particularly well, but I have colour-coded them. And yeah, so you've got caesura, which is breaking the line. Epizeusis, which is the repetition of two words with, or repetition of a word with no word in between them. Anadiplosis, which is the repetition of phrases without a break in between. Polyptoton, which is the use of the same root word but in two or more different forms, and also within this there is a contradiction here. Got the quotation, which is also direct speech and an allusion. Several examples of imagery, which is quite self-explanatory, and then at the end here is to some extent imagery, but it's a realistic image, so realism. So in terms of concepts, the three main ones I'd look at in this poem are feminism, Marxism and historicism. That applies similarly to most of feminine Gospels. AA2, looking at what each of these terminology terms actually means. So the caesura breaks up the flow. It's a symbol of life's uneven pattern and also of the difficulties that Marilyn had in her life. The epizeusis emphasises the word harder. It suggests the idea of exploitation. Not only are the media filming her harder, but she is finding it harder to be filmed, potentially. That duality. The anadiplosis, quite frankly, it does overwhelm the reader. The quiet, please, action cut, quiet, please, action cut, quiet, please, action cut. It's just like his monotony, because it goes on for quite a long time, and it's certainly quick pace. The aesthetic nature of the list is also typical of Duffy. So the polyptation, got the contrasting ideas of whether she's dying or not dying. Possibly if she can't die, when she dies she can't be at peace. This is an indication of duality, or also the potential that the reason she can't die is because she's left such a legacy, especially in films. Quotations, direct speech and allusion are typical of Duffy, and they tie into other poems, the rest of Beautiful, of course, and also it demonstrates the relevance to life. A lot of people reading this in 2002 would have probably watched when Marilyn sung to President Kennedy, sung Happy Birthday to him. Imagery, you've got suggestions of extremes. I'm focusing particularly on this second stanza. Her hair was platinum, her teeth gems, her eyes sapphires pressed by the banker's thumb. The idea that Marilyn's life was taken over completely by media and by beauty, and there's a possible criticism within that. And then the realism is a reminder of the relevance, similarly to the illusion. It's also quite gruesome, quite sexual actually, and it highlights exploitation and lack of privacy. So AA3, I've just got some standard points about Marilyn. So she married 3 times. First of all to James III, which is less well known about, and then she had 2 high-profile marriages, one to Joe DiMaggio, suggested here, an athlete, she married him, and then Arthur Miller, who was a playwright or a poet, she married him. She was called the most advertised girl in the world. She was actually discovered, oh sorry about the R there. She was discovered on an assembly line during World War II. Her name as a child, she was born Norma Mortensen. She died of an overdose of barbiturate, I think, when she was aged just 36. And it was listed as probable suicide because the amounts of the substance in her body was so high above the lethal dose, and because she did suffer from depression, etc. So she was born in 1926, died in 1962, and really had come to fame from about 1944, was when she was powerful. So she was born in 1926, died in 1962. She had a hard childhood, spent most of her time either in foster homes or in an orphanage. And she rose to fame very quickly after her discovery, spending some time initially as a model, acting in lower profile films, and then becoming a real national icon, or global icon. She had the image of the dumb blonde, quite typical of her, though she tried to escape this later in her career. And she had a very powerful sexual image. As mentioned before, she suffered from various mental health conditions, and she remains an iconic figure. So AO4. So really typical of Duffy to allude to other texts and to allude to history, so cross-referencing it within feminine gospels. You've got sub, history, loud, and then outside of feminine gospels, the Wild's Wife. So typical of third wave feminism, which during the third wave of feminism, Caroline Duffy wrote this to focus on the female presence. And it's again typical of Duffy to use demotic language. I'm thinking especially of these last lines here, the dark roots of her pubic hair, but throughout very casual, colloquial language. For AO5, rather than giving you two different interpretations, I've just set up some questions which I think promote the idea that there are two sides to this. So, say, is Duffy criticising the media? To what extent is there a criticism of a consumerist society? Is this section of the poem pro or anti-feminist? How is sexuality portrayed? And what could be the significance of the consistent stanza ends? So that's really quite a brief overview of this part of the poem, but I hope it's been helpful just to focus on those AOs. So for the fourth section of Beautiful, what you can see here are some of my notes, colour-coded. I hope it makes sense to you. This is a way in which I like to work. But I'm not going to talk through these notes. I hope they're quite self-explanatory. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments. But I know that this video has already been very long, so I'd encourage you to read through them. And as I say, if you have any questions, ask me in the comments section below and I'll do my best to explain.